To call upon Rabbi Macy to give the lecture tonight.
I think I've known the story of the Megillah, or at least I thought I did, since I was about 5 years old, 4 years old. I won't tell you how many years ago that is. I think all of you have read the Megillah and have heard it read, and certainly know the story for, let us say, a number of decades. I don't see anyone here under 20, maybe I'm not looking well, but... in any event, having reread it or heard it at least twice each Purim, each year, well, I would assume that by now we know the story of Purim. And each year I discover things that I never knew before. I want to share some of them with you this evening. But to a certain degree, my understanding of the story of Purim differs very significantly from the patent text of the Megillah, the story that's told in Hebrew schools and elementary schools and yeshivos, and which one grows up with. And the reason is because Megillat Esther is not the only source of the Purim story. Now, it certainly is the original source, but not the only. And let me therefore get into a different question altogether. The Book of Esther was one of the last of the books to be included in Tanakh. There was considerable controversy among our sages about whether it should be included in Tanakh. Whether it is in fact a holy or divinely inspired book. What's more, and we know what the conclusion was. It was included in Tanakh, it's part of Tanakh. Non-Jewish and secular Jewish historians have raised more doubts about the Book of Esther than about any other book of the Bible, of Tanakh. As far as most non-Jewish biblical scholars are concerned, they do not really believe that the story ever occurred. Of course, that's, as far as they're concerned, that's true of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov too. I once heard a Rabbi of mine say many years ago that there are many Christians who believe that Jesus never existed, but nevertheless it was the Jews who crucified him. The Book of Esther has had many doubts cast upon it. And why do you think the Book of Esther has been doubted more than any other book? Obvious reason. Because we don't find a parallel story in Persian royal records. And since we need the Persian royal records to prove anything that's written in the Bible, otherwise how can you accept the Bible at face value? Therefore there is great doubt as to whether it occurred. Well, it is true that we are not certain exactly when the Purim story occurred, and that's from a Jewish point of view. We're not quite certain exactly when. I can tell you between when and when. It was sometime between 516 of the Common Era, before the Common Era, and 400. During that century, let's say 516 to 416, that it occurred. There's no doubt about that. As far as I'm concerned, there's no doubt that it occurred as well. We have some difficulty identifying Ahasuerus as one of the Persian kings. He has been alternatively identified as Xerxes, Artaxerxes, or one of the Dariuses. And all of these three, by the way, are have Jewish sources for them as well. The likelihood is that he was Xerxes, about whom, was it Handel who wrote an opera? Xerxes? And the reason that that is the likelihood has nothing to do with the dates, because we don't know what the dates are, but because the character of Ahasuerus seems very much to match the character of Xerxes. A fun-loving, party-going, imbibing, womanizing king. Now, that's Ahasuerus, but that may have been a dozen other Persian kings as well. Why am I so certain of the date? Because from within Jewish sources we know that it was after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. It was the Persian Empire, but before the time that the Second Temple was built. And now, since we don't know what year the Second Temple was built exactly, because there are conflicting sources on that, so it's somewhere in between that time. By which source? Esther didn't give 400 BCE. Quite possibly it might have been later, and if we count the 70 years of Babel exactly, then it has to be earlier. So as I said, there are different sources. I'll be happy to discuss it on another occasion. But it is important that we know some of the things about the Book of Esther within its setting, which will help us to better understand why Chazal at first missed the point and finally agreed unanimously that if any book belongs in Tanakh, this book belongs in Tanakh. That's an interesting discovery. It didn't come all at once. Most secular students of Tanakh, of Bible, will generally try to understand the Bible in the light of other historical records, in the light of archaeological findings, in the light of anthropology, both the known and the unknown within anthropology, and these are all certainly authentic methods of studying history, if the Bible is only history. But there are other disciplines from which one can approach the study of biblical texts. And this, aside from the sources themselves, I think, and certainly in the light of our own intellectual development today, I think that the fields of political science and the field of psychology are vital to any understanding of Megillat Esther, more so than history or anthropology. I mean, this is a political story, and it involved some very, very delicate psychological interfacing. I think we ought to try to understand it from that source. Now, I must tell you at the outset, although it should not come as news to any of you, that I am not a prophet or a clairvoyant. I have no special wires that tell me what happened there. But I have a few sources that most historians do not have. My sources are firstly a very famous perush to Esther that's called the Targum Sheni, which is from Tannaitic times. It's only a couple of centuries after the story occurred. A Talmud Yerushalmi, which is not widely known and certainly not studied in most schools, and the Gemara Megillah, the text of the tractate Megillah in the Talmud, which does a great deal of interpretative exegesis on the text of the Megillah. Sometimes it's so way out that we just cross it off as Agadata, but sometimes there are kernels of understanding or insight in the text of the Gemara, which we ought to be able to fit into the text of the Megillah. And I'm not going to read the Megillah, I mean, word for word and give shot in text, and certainly not going to go through the laws of Purim tonight. That's not my intent. But I want to put the Megillah into the perspective of its own period in order to better understand just what happened and what is its special significance to the Jewish people, so that of all of the many victories and salvations that occurred in ancient times, this was the first and most important to be commemorated historically, year by year and generation by generation in every place in the world. It's the only one of its kind. Even Hanukkah didn't quite attain the level of Purim. Okay. And by the way, when you read the Megillah this Purim, for whatever it's worth, to me the most significant prakim, the chapters that really set the framework for the Megillah, are chapters 1 and chapter 6. I mean, the rest of it's all important. You have not fulfilled hearing the Megillah if you miss any of the Megillah. But chapter 1 and chapter 6 are the most significant chapters in the unfolding of the chapter 1 of the setting and chapter 6 of the plot. And those are the ones I'll concentrate on tonight. Actually, I'll be concentrating in the first 5 or 10 minutes. This may turn out to be a long lecture. I'll cut it short if I see that I have to. The first few minutes of the text, I'm going to concentrate on pre-chapter 1. What happened before chapter 1 began? Because that becomes a basic idea in the Megillah. Okay. Let's go through some world history for a few minutes. The kingdom of Judea is conquered and defeated by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. The accepted date for this historically is 586. On that, we're not worried about 586 BCE, although Jewish sources would have it somewhat later. But these are the secular and well-grounded sources. And at that time, the temple was destroyed and the people were exiled, at least many of the people were exiled, and the land lay pretty desolate, and thus it was destined to be for 70 years, the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. That was in 586. In 596, 10 years earlier, remember this is BC, so the numbers are coming down. In 596, the king of Judea, Jehoiachin, was taken by the Babylonians as hostage for the good behavior of Judea. And with him went many of the wise men, the leaders, and the aristocracy of the people of Judea. Now this is before the Churban, 10 years before. Among those who left Jerusalem with this particular, let's call it a mini exile, but in more modern terms we would call it a brain drain, because it was the Sanhedrin that left with Jehoiachin. Among those who left was a Jew named Mordechai. Now how do I know this? It says so. Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan Avira, Ushmo Mordechai, etc., etc., etc. Asher hadla miYerushalayim im hagola asher hadlata im Yechonya melech Yehuda. Asher hadla Nebuchadnezzar melech Babylon. It's staring you right in the face in chapter 2. Now, since Yechonya went into exile 10 years earlier, which means what? Which means that Mordechai and his colleagues, all right, the king was under house arrest, but the rest of the Jewish aristocracy had a chance to acclimate themselves and get acquainted with Babylonian surroundings well before the real exile began. They became the establishment. They were not the grina when the exiles came. Of course, they were the enemies of Babylon. But it was an enmity that was not an activist, militant enmity, but simply Jews in Golus, who knew how to behave vis-a-vis their Goyish overlords without antagonizing them and maintaining a certain amount of autonomy. When the other exiles came 10 years later, Mordechai and his colleagues were the Roshei Kohol. They were the leaders of the community, having established the original community. They were there before they were looked up to. Their position was, so to speak, assured. Nebuchadnezzar died. He was succeeded by a son, Adil Merodach. Vilma Rodach was a Nebush, and he didn't last very long. And he was a great peace lover, and I don't say that cynically. He was a peace lover. He released Yechonia from house arrest. Little did he know that he was responsible for the continuation of the house of David, because had he not released Yechonia, there might have been no descendants of the Davidic kingdom. Vilma Rodach died shortly thereafter, just a few years, and he was succeeded by his son Belshazzar. Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, is the king of Babylon, was also a paranoid to beat the band. I mean, this guy was scared of his shadow. Everything written about him indicates this, and he was a fatalist. There's a very famous saying, which is attributed to a fellow named, to the Stoics of Greece: eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. It was Belshazzar who said that. Now, he might have gotten it from the Greeks, or they might have gotten it from him. But it's a passage in Tanakh, in the book of Daniel. Achol v'shato ki machal namut. Eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Now, you know what kind of a lifestyle and what kind of attitude, what kind of mental state, what kind of psyche is represented by this eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die syndrome. Well, Belshazzar was always afraid that they were out to kill him, so he used to double his guard and triple his guard. And one night at a big party, he loved parties, eat, drink, and be merry, he saw the handwriting on the wall. Not figuratively, but literally. The handwriting on the wall, and he called Danny Boy to interpret it for him, and Daniel told him, tonight you will be conquered, tomorrow the Persians claim the empire, and he said no way, and he quadrupled his guard and made very special passwords and everything, and he couldn't sleep that night. In the middle of the night, he decided to go down and see if the guards were doing their duty and guarding well, and they were. And he forgot the password. And they buried him the next morning. He was shot by his own guards. But that day, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persian Empire. Cyrus I of Persia came in as the king, and thus began the long era of the Persian Empire after the Babylonian Empire. Now, we go by a certain sociological principle, which has its place in Yiddish folklore as well. My enemy's enemy is my friend. Therefore, if the Babylonians were the enemies of the Jews, and the Babylonians were the enemies of the Persians, because the Persians defeated them, that made the Persians and the Jews allies. So the Persian Empire came in and started on a very pro-Jewish approach. They recognized what Jewish history was. They had very good vibes about it. They knew how they had suffered and lasted against the Babylonians, and they were not only ready to embrace the Jewish community, but Cyrus I actually gave them a royal edict, a permit to go back to the land of Israel, to go back to Eretz Israel, to rebuild their temple, and may God be with you. And that's the last passage in the Book of Kings. Fine, wonderful. So the Jews had a good life under the Persians. They grew, both in number and in status. The Jews established good businesses. You know what Jews do in Golis. Jews became a very significant part of the center, the capital of the Persian Empire. I have a number of proofs to that, and they're all from the Megillah. Number one, Mordechai Yoshev B'Shar HaMelech. I mean, this is already 2 generations later. Mordechai was an old man by this time. But he was one who sat in the king's gate. Now, that does not mean that Mordechai was a ragged schnorrer who sat like this in the king's gate with his hand open for an alms. Mordechai was a courtier. He was one of those who ministered. He was a regular at the king's court. But he was Jewish. No, so what? Persians have nothing against Jews. When the decree was given, I'm running ahead of myself a bit. The Megillah says, V'ha'ir Shushan Navocha. The city of Shushan was in a quandary, was bewildered. Now, if the Megillah had said the Jews in Shushan were bewildered, I would have understood. Why was the city bewildered? And then again, when the decree was reversed, Vehoir Shushan Sohalo V'Samecha. It's even harder to understand. The city of Shushan rejoiced that the Jews were saved. Why should the city of Shushan rejoice if the Jews were saved? If the Megillah had said the Jews of Shushan rejoiced, I understand. The city of Shushan rejoiced because the city of Shushan was a Jewish city. It was a Jewish city. Like Warsaw in 1938, before the Nazis came in. 55% of Warsaw's population was Jewish. The capital of Poland, and an anti-Semitic capital at that. And yet 55% of the population was Jewish. And I don't have to be an anti-Semite to say the Jews controlled everything in Warsaw. That was true in Shushan with Gutzkeit, not with anti-Semitism, not with Pilsudski. And there's more. When the king made his feast just for the Shushanites. So all the Jews in town were there. Everybody was in fact. Chazal said, why did the Jews of that generation deserve the threat of annihilation? Because they feasted so much at the feast of Achashverosh. They drank whatever wine he served them out of the vessels of the Beis HaMikdash, and they were ready to say, we don't have to see Mashiach now in his Suda. It can't beat this part. You Jews saying things like that, you know why that was a generation that would ultimately face destruction. But about the time, it at least tells us, Jews were very much liked and very well favored and very highly thought of and respected and played a major role in the political life of Shushan. That's a premise from which I won't back down. Achashverosh was not an anti-Semite. No way. Nor were the other Persian kings for that matter. Now let's go further. But who were the underdogs in the Persian Empire? Well, just one guess. The Babylonians. After all, there were a lot of Babylonian captives in the Persian Empire. They were the defeated. They were the enemy. They were possibly a fifth column. And they were like, if I had to draw a modern historical parallel, they were like the czarist supporters and the nobilities after the revolution. So they all got together in Paris and they sort of continued St. Petersburg in exile. After all the Parisian taxi drivers were Russians in 1920, 1921. Like all the New York taxi drivers are Israelis, all for different reasons. Well, there was a Babylonian entity. It wasn't a state, but there was a Babylonian colony, if you will, who were suspect, were highly suspect, because after all, they had been defeated by Persians. But who was Babylonia then? Belshazzar was dead. Were there any other vestiges of Babylonian royalty? Was there maybe a Princess Anastasia who survived the Persian onslaught and who was at least the figurehead leader of Babylonian society? You bet there was. She was a granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and her name was Vashti. Once you know that Vashti is the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, then a lot of things begin to fall into place. Because here the Megillah begins. Vayhi bimei Achashverosh. It was in the days of Achashverosh. Now, the Torah is very careful about titles and respect. And it does not begin Vayhi bimei HaMelech Achashverosh. Vayhi bimei Achashverosh. And at that point you say, who? Achashverosh. Amalek, I don't know if you've ever caught that one, but I know. Vayhi bimei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh Amalek. Who? Achashverosh. Hamolech mehodu vad Kush, who happened to rule from India to Ethiopia. What do you happen to rule? Then call him Hamelech Achashverosh. Again, through sources other than the Megillah, through the Gemara, and through the Targum Sheni of Esther, we know Achashverosh was not of the royal lineage. Achashverosh was a colonel, one of the many Middle Eastern colonels who are constantly fomenting coup d'etat, who make revolutions and take over. And he molech himself. He made himself king. after Darius I, which was the successor of Cyrus I. And now, it's not easy to take over an empire like the Persian Empire with 127 provinces. You don't do this overnight. It's not Nicaragua. It took him 2.5 years to do it. For 2.5 years, he tried very, very hard to establish himself as the king of the Persian Empire, even though he always must have had that bit of inferiority complex that he wasn't really royalty. He wasn't to the manner born. He was an upstart. One of the ways, and by the way, this is again implicit in the Megillah. Vayhi kisheves hamelech Achashverosh al kisei malchut. Excuse my Ashkenazi, it keeps coming across. Second passage. And it was when King Achashverosh sat on his throne. What does it mean when he sat on his throne? It's old King Cole. I mean, what? It means when his throne was established. When there was a throne to sit on and he wasn't afraid that someone was going to shoot him in the back. So then he made a party. Because until that time he couldn't afford to celebrate. He couldn't make a party to establish his kingdom because he wasn't sure it was established. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made this big party. Now, one of the ways in which he established his kingdom and legitimized himself was by effecting a very advantageous marriage. He married a princess royal, Vashti. She not only gave him legitimacy because she was of royal blood, and he became not worse than Prince Philip, king, okay, but even more. With her, he was able to unite the Babylonians and the Persians, which had never been done. The Babylonians are not going to rebel against Vashti. He made her queen. The fact is that she thinks she made him king. And that little bit of dialectic, that little him and her, carries out throughout the 1st chapter of the Megillah. But you know where you see it? Very interesting. You have to watch for this. Whenever Achashverosh talks to Vashti, he speaks to Vashti Hamalka. Whenever Vashti responds, it's Hamalka Vashti. It's consistent. What's Pshat? He says to her, Vashti Hamalka. You're Vashti. I made you queen. And she says, Hamalka Vashti. I am the queen. My name is Vashti. But my queenship comes before my Vashtiness. And don't you forget it, you upstart, you little colonel. Now, this was a delicate kind of relationship, as you may guess, because Vashti had all the arrogance of a princess royal. But he couldn't do very much about it because he needed that alliance with the Babylonians. But in the 3rd year of his reign, he was already pretty well established. And he had this party for 180 days. 6 months, 180 days. For all the princes, all the aristocracy, all the nobility of all of the 127 provinces. At the end of this party, he made another party. Why? The first party was purely political in nature. The party was to establish the homage and the loyalty, the allegiance of the heads of all the provinces. And that's why everyone came and each one was given to eat of his ethnic foods and to drink of his ethnic wines. You've read all this. But why did the Megillah go to such an extent in chapter 1 to describe the physical appearance of the palace, the hangings and the carpets and the divans and the gold and the silver and the onyx? Achashverosh was putting on his show, I am king. And everybody responded, Amen, you are king. It took 6 months. When that was well established, then he could have a party for Hamishim. The second party was only a 7-day party. But who was that party for? L'chol ha'om hanimtziim b'Shushan habiro. Only for the citizens of Shushan. To begin with, the citizens of Shushan were the ones who would have to carry the expense and the burdens of the 6 months of the other people party. Who cooked the food? Who cleaned the floors? Who did the laundry? During all those 6 months of the party, the Shushan people. So I used to quip to my children, who shined the shoes? The Shushan boys. However, now he makes a party lebigadol va'ad koton. Everybody in Shushan, up to bottom. And at this party, he allows himself the luxury of getting drunk. And that's very dangerous for a person who is in a sensitive position and always has to be on guard for the right word. A diplomat cannot afford to get drunk. Not in vain did the Senate reject John Tower as Secretary of Defense. He's allowed his foibles, but not when the whole defense of the country depends on it. Achashverosh made that mistake. And on the 7th day of his drunken orgy, he decides, I'm going to show Vashti who's boss. Well, you know the story. Called, she wouldn't come, she didn't come. She got leprosy, she didn't get leprosy. It doesn't bother me that she had leprosy or not. That medlish I can live without. She wouldn't come. Her pride did not let her come. And she was right. From her point of view, she was absolutely right. A chutzpah, this upstart, calling Vashti to be a go-go dancer. Okay, so what do you do? No, there's a guy named Memuchan there, whom Chazal identified as Haman. And Memuchan sees this as a chance to advance himself. He gives the king advice, get rid of her. Show him who's the boss. So the king follows the advice. And Memuchan is always ready with advice. He has the scenario all thought out. It's Haman. Let the king write a letter to, by royal edict, and get this, by royal edict, the Queen Vashti is banished. By royal edict, every man shall be the master in his house. By royal edict, no husband shall be henpecked. By royal edict. By royal edict, the language spoken in the house should be the language of the husband. Any intelligent person receiving such royal edicts, what's going on now? What tippish is this Achashverosh? Who's sitting on the throne? This you can make a royal edict? Oh. Achashverosh sobers up the next day. Zochares Vashti ve'es asher asasa. He remembered 3 years of careful planning. He muffed it in 1 hour, one drunken hour. And who is this Memuchan who gave him the idea to... And what is this decree that he sent out? And the runner's already left. Well, let's him get some chufim, 1, 2, 3. He says, I look like a fool in the eyes of the kingdom. No, Memuchan is not going to let him linger on this particular issue. So he says, have an idea. Take another queen. Have a beauty contest. Enjoy yourself for a few years. You know the details of the contest. But it was more than that. Haman had already pegged Achashverosh as a man who liked parties. He liked to make a l'chaim. Wine, women, and song were very much in his favorite occupations. And he was willing to leave the affairs of state, now that he thought he was well established, to leave the affairs of state to others, and he would pardon. It's a certain transition, it's a watershed in Achashverosh's life. Because until then, he was a brilliant strategist. So there were Pekidim, the bureaucracy was set up. And only in modern Israel do you know what Pekidim. The bureaucracy was set up to gather in all the virgins from all over the country, etc., etc. And there's a beauty contest, and suddenly the scene shifts. Ish Yehudi hayav b'Shushan. There was this Jew in Shushan, Mordechai. And he had a cousin named Esther, Bat Abichail, whom he had raised as his daughter. But he was betrothed, wasn't betrothed to her. Read the Medrash. Raises his daughter. She's obviously virgin. She was beautiful, even if green. She was young, even if 90. If you know the Midrashim, you know what I'm saying. It's a young, beautiful thing. And she has to go too. Now tell me, does she want to be chosen or not want to be chosen? What do you think?
I think she did, because if her cousin suggested it to her, she wouldn't have thwarted him yet.
It's the law. She had to go. But did she go to smile?
That he look up, possibly.
Can you imagine a young girl growing up in Mordechai's house, Mordechai, a member of the Sanhedrin, that wants to marry a goy even if he's the king? You had married the goy. What's that? I cannot conceive of Esther willingly going. She had to go, it was the law. But she should have done everything in her power not to be chosen. And she didn't. She should have done everything not to be chosen. In fact, as we read the Megillah now, usually the first thing she should have said is, I'm a Jew. No, well, we're thinking in modern terms. What would that have meant if she said, I'm a Jew? No! The Jews were very favored. She was a part of a high and very important community.
Wasn't she counseled by Mordecai not to say it?
That's why she didn't say it, because that way it would reduce her chances of being chosen. Just the opposite of what you have done. But I'll go further. Ready for a bombshell? According to most of Chazal and most Jewish sources, Achashverosh knew she was a Jew, and there was no hiding the fact she was a Jew, and everybody knew she was a Jew. That was never a secret. The Megillah says Mordechai told her. Mordechai told her not to tell et amma ve'et moladeta, and this is an ambiguous statement. Esther was also of royal blood. She is a direct descendant of King Saul. And a princess royal. In exile, it's true, but so was Vashti. Had Ahasuerus known that one of the young women, and a pretty one at that, was a princess of royal blood, there is no doubt she would have been chosen. And that's why Mordechai told her, don't tell. Don't tell your family or who you are, because that would increase your chances, and we don't want to increase your chances. Do what you have to do naturally, but don't help it. And therefore, Esther did not reveal that she was Mordechai's cousin, that she was his ward, anything about her family background. She was a foundling, but a Jewish one. And there's no question that the king knew she was Jewish from beginning to end throughout the Megillah. That, of course, is the major difference between the usual story and whatever. And that changes a lot of things as we go on, as we will see. Esther is chosen. Good. Well, we won't go through all the details. Esther is chosen. And Achashverosh is mystified by this beautiful girl of unquestionable courtly manners. Just the description of Esther is exquisite. And who are you? The mystery girl. She doesn't tell. I know you're Jewish. Nothing. He tries to make her jealous. He says, I'm going to run another contest. I'll have another queen. She doesn't say a word. So she remains the anonymous Jewess. Then suddenly, in the middle of everything, there's a plot against the king. And the king escapes the plot through Esther. Esther tells the king that one of the Jews, whom she knows well, Mordechai, informed her that... Well, why didn't the king wonder that Mordechai informed Esther? It was only natural, because they were both Jews. Everybody knows the Jews have their little inner network. And Mordechai informed Esther, the Jewish queen, who informed her husband. But that meant, A, that the Jews were loyal to him, that he found the queen who was loyal, and she had good connections in court who were also loyal. That made him feel good. It also indicated that people were still out to get him, that his, his kingdom was not as firmly established as he would have liked it to be, as he thought it was when he began to make the party. Fine. So he began to worry. Along comes, guess who? He says, what are you worried about? Trust me. Leave it all to me. Beginning of chapter 3. Achar hadvarim ha'ele gidal hamelech Achashverosh et Haman ben Haman. The statesman becomes Secretary of State, Prime Minister to the king. King doesn't have to worry about a thing now. Haman will take care of everything. Good. Haman is a classic anti-Semite. Classic anti-Semite. He is Amalek. Ben Hamdataha Agagi. Agag was the king of Amalek. Haman is the stereotypical anti-Semite in a place of power. And he's going to use that power to get those Jews. The queen is Jewish. No, Dukakis' wife was also Jewish. She's a white. She's a white. With Esther, it'll be all right. It's those dirty Jews with the long beards like Mordechai. And when Mordechai showed a certain stubborn streak, it's Haman and his self-idolatry. So he gidulo et am Mordechai. His anger is not directed only at Mordechai, but at all the people that Mordechai represents. So he goes to the king. Now watch this plot unfold. He goes to the king and says, Yeshno Amecha, there is a certain nation in this country with cells everywhere. I have discovered a fifth column. They are hidden, they are well entrenched. They are absolutely rebellious against the king. They contribute nothing to the kingdom except misery and divisiveness. And we have to take a strong hand in this matter, and I strongly recommend that the king simply liquidate this cancerous sore in the midst of the nation, and we'll be rid of the fifth columns forever. No more assassination attempts. Everything will be fine. What word did Haman not use? Jew. He never mentioned the word Jew. Because had Haman told Achashverosh, the Jews are the fifth column, Achashverosh would have said, you're crazy. Esther's a Jew. Mordechai saved my life. The Jews are half of Shushan. If they didn't want me as king, they could have gotten rid of me a long time ago. I haven't got another people as loyal to me as the Jews in all of Shushan. So Haman just carefully neglected to mention that he meant the Jews. But you have to write the decree. The king at this time is beginning to wonder who Haman means, and Haman says, look, don't bother yourself with it. I can take care of it. In fact, I'll do it at my own expense to show my loyalty to the king. 10,000 talents of silver to the king's treasury, if the king will give me permission to wipe out this fifth column, this nation. So the king doesn't say, well, draw up the documents and bring it to me and I'll study it, and then I will decide whether to permit it. The king takes off his ring and gives it to Haman, the signet ring, and says, Haman, I trust you. Write the documents, seal it with my seal, and send out whatever decrees you want. Don't bother me with details. I don't even want to know who. Achashverosh never knew that the decree that he had signed was against the Jew. And the proof is very simple, aside from Rashi, who says it. But the proof is very simple. In chapter 7 later, when Esther says, I and my people have been sold to liquidation, to destruction, the king says, who, you? Who would dare? The Jews? Who would dare? He never knew that the Jews were being threatened. When Esther tells him, Haman hara hazeh, has decided to destroy the Jews, a whole new line of things. But we're running ahead of ourselves now, and I'm running a little late. Haman sends out the decree against the Jews. The runners go out, Lahashmi, Laro, Bala'abe. He drew lots for what would be a lucky month and a lucky day. Fortunately, it came out 11 months later. And so it wasn't next week we'll kill the Jews, 11 months from now, because this happened on Pesach. Purim is 11 months exactly later than Pesach. You check the calendar in the Megillah. Okay. The Hamelech v'Haman yashvu lishtot. The king and Haman sat down to his favorite occupation. Ve'ha'ir Shushan la'och. And the city of Shushan didn't know what hit it. Now, Mordechai finds out what's happened. The decree is out. Esther certainly doesn't know what has happened. And now we watch another. I would not be overstating the case if I said conflict. Mordechai finds out what happens. He rips his clothes. He puts on sackcloth. He goes into the streets. They give out Rabbeinu Shalom, and sends a message to Esther. We've been sold down the river. We're going to be killed. They'll take us into gas chambers. Quick, run to the king and fall on your knees and beg him, please, your majesty, save the Jews. And Esther says, in 10 sentences, no. It took her 10 sentences to say it. She can't just say no. No. Esther starts back with a whole ASIC. I mean, everybody knows that you can't just run in onto the king. It's not etiquette. It's not court manners. Anyone who goes in without being called is killed, and I haven't been called for 30 days already, and it's not likely he's going to call me so soon again, and we have to wait for the right time. And Mordechai reads this as what? As fear and selfishness on Esther's part. And he writes back to her, if you remain silent at this time, you will be destroyed, we will be saved by some other source. So Esther says to him, writes back to him, quick change of mind. Mordechai, my dear uncle, you're right as usual. I have to go into the king to beseech him for my people, but I can't just go in now. I haven't done Shuvah yet. Say to him, for 3 days, let everybody fast, make a tainus, let them pray, let them daven, let them say slichas and tefillin, and I will do the same thing. Tefillah milchama. And after 3 days, I'll take my life into my hands and I'll go into the king. Now, where did Esther suddenly become so fluid? 3 days you should fast and say tefillin. And if that's the thing to do, then Mordechai should have known that too. I mean, very simple. Mordechai panicked. And what do you do when you panic? You begin to scream, and you do that which is the most irrational thing in the world. Esther realized immediately what the situation was, and she knew her customer. She knew Ahasuerus. And she knew that a direct conflict with Haman, she may lose. Never can tell. Ahasuerus is a very suspicious person. He's been the target of assassination attempts. She has been a mystery to him, which now begins to bother her a little bit. Maybe she should have been more open with him. She doesn't know how she'll come out in a face-to-face confrontation. I need time. I need time to think. I need time to decide how to get to Ahasuerus. I need time to make Ahasuerus realize on his own that something's wrong, and he'll look for an answer, and I'll supply it. I don't go ask the questions. I come to give the answers. And that can't be done overnight. But Mordechai's not going to understand that, not in his present state. So she says to Mordechai, say till him for 3 days. Mordechai says, okay. Good to Flumi Yiddish in the Shama, accepted. On the 3rd day, I will go into the king. What do we do? Anyway, Esther gets dressed in all of her beauty, royal raiment, her perfumes. Why is she running in a panic? I mean, she's not going in there to beg the king. That would be wrong, and on the contrary, that would put the king on his guard. Mordechai's approach is over. She is going in to seduce the king. Simply put. And she dresses for it. Megillah takes a half a chapter to describe how she dressed and how she talked. She comes in and she says, this has to be read. On the third day, Esther clothed herself in royal raiment and so forth and so on. And when the king saw, and she didn't walk in, she passed by the gate, the door where the king was, just sort of passed by outside where he would notice. She didn't run into him. And he saw her, and at that moment, his heart sort of skipped a beat. And he realized that he hadn't had her for over a month. And he raises his scepter and says, come in. Anything I can do for you, Esther? To half the kingdom. Now, this to half the kingdom has midrashic significance too. According to Rashi and the Gemara, he says to her, I will give you anything you want up to the midpoint of my kingdom. Till half the kingdom. Shall half, the midpoint of Hodu Vad Kush is Yerushalayim. He says, I will not rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. I can't take that chance. Apparently she had mentioned that a few times, that he could do the Jews a big favor and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash and allow them to return to Yerushalayim. And he said, no, I can't make that mistake. Nebuchadnezzar made that mistake. It's political. I know you wanted Esther, you're Jewish. I know how you feel, but it's politically too dangerous. The midrashic interpretation of that pasuk, which also shows that he knew that she was Jewish. And he says, Ad chatzi amal, vatome Esther, im al hamelech tov, if would please find favor in your eyes, would you come to a little party this afternoon? A drinking party. Come have cocktails with me. I haven't seen you for such a long time. I haven't had the pleasure of your company. We'll just have a little intimate party in my quarters. You and me. King says. And Your Majesty, would you bring your charming Prime Minister along? I'd love to get to know him better. Ménage à trois. Just you and me and somebody else. And who? The King's Prime Minister. If that was calculated to do anything, it was calculated to make Achashverosh be suspicious of him. It's very simple. She played her psychology well. The king says, fine. He sends his shlichim, his messengers, go tell Haman to come to a cocktail party with the queen, 4 p.m. sharp. Haman is he's ecstatic. And now you see his own pride beginning to get in the way of his good sense. Right? And they come, and they drink, and they chatter, and they exchange pleasantries, and they do whatever people do at cocktail parties. And the king says, all right, now I know that you didn't call us just for a drink. You have the king here, you have the prime minister, you obviously have something in mind. What is it, Esther? So, Esther says, and Esther answers, Vatan Esther, Vatomar, She'elati ubakashati, Imatzati chen be'enei hamelech, Ve'im al hamelech tov, Latet et she'elati, Ve'lasot et bakashati. You said 2 psukim here and has said absolutely nothing yet. She has said absolutely nothing in 2 psukim. If you really want to, Your Majesty, and if I have found favor in your eyes, and if you really mean that you're willing to do anything for me, up to half the kingdom, and if you really want to know what I want, you really, yeah, what? Yavo hamelech v'haman el hamishte asher e'eseleh. Umachar e'eseh kitvam. Come to another party tomorrow. You and Haman. Your company is great. I haven't enjoyed myself so much in a long time. Come and bring Haman. And tomorrow I'll tell you what you've always wanted to know. Machar e'eseh kitvam. The mystery will be revealed. So the king, on the one hand, great, the mystery will be revealed. Who is Esther? On the other hand, what does she need Haman for? Why does he have to be here? I mean, the most intimate secret between the king and queen is who is Esther? So Haman has to be around. That night, the king couldn't sleep. And now we know why the king couldn't sleep. It wasn't just a sudden attack in Mitzrayim. He was worried. Haman, meanwhile, went home and he told his wife and his sons, oh, you can't imagine what fortune has struck me. So what fortune? So his wife, but all the fly in the ointment is Mordechai. So Vashti says to him, not Vashti, Zeresh says to him, so make a gallows 50 amos high tomorrow. You go to the king and you go to the king right away. Tell him that tomorrow you want to hang Mordechai. Great idea. And again, Haman lets his emotions get in the way of his rationality. Go to the king right away, but when is right away? I mean, by the time he got home from the cocktail party, by the time he talked with Zeresh, by the time they discussed all the things that happened that day, and he gave the advice, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Go to the king right away. He forgets to look at his watch, and he runs to the king in the middle of the night to wake him up, to tell him, I got a great idea for tomorrow, I want to hang Mordechai. It's negligence, it's on Haman's part. The king, meanwhile, can't sleep. It's bothering him. He knows there's trouble afoot. This is not a simple thing. Has he fallen out of favor with Esther? Is Haman a rival? Are Haman and Esther cooking up something? Will tomorrow be his last day? Is there anything in the records that shows what might be? He calls for the Book of Chronicles, that it be read. Now everybody interprets that meaning. He calls them to read the Book of Chronicles so that he'll fall asleep, because who can sit and listen to the Chronicles? But that's silly. He wanted to find some clue to what was happening. And in the Book of Chronicles they read that Mordechai saved the king's life, and the king said, I haven't seen Mordechai around lately. What's he doing? What did we do for Mordechai? Nothing. Nothing. Mordechai saved the king's life through Esther, and the king is ungrateful? No wonder I've turned Esther against me. No wonder she'd go with him. I made a terrible mistake, and I will make it up to Mordechai and to Esther. And at that moment, he hears rustling in the bushes, and he suspects right away. What is it? An assassination attempt. And he said, Mi b'chotzer. Who is that? The way you might say when you hear a burglar. And the courtiers and guards, they say, Haman is here. Haman, now, in the middle of the night. They couldn't wait for tomorrow. The plot is going to be hatched tonight. And the king alerts his guards and he says, Yavo, let him come in. Vayavo Haman. And he came in totally oblivious of what's going on in the king's mind. And the king says to Haman, my dear Lord Prime Minister, if I wanted to honor somebody who has done me great service, how should I do it? Haman, Lanius who then but me, tells them, well, you should bring the royal robes and the royal horse and the royal crown, dress the person, make a parade in the street, show him the homage of royalty. Now that's all the king had to hear. Because Ahasuerus, he has designs on the throne. I was right. This man has turned against me. I shouldn't have trusted him to begin with. He is a villain. And the king says to Haman, take everything that you said, except that when the king repeats it, he leaves out the crown. He does not include the crown. He says the royal robes and the horse, no crown. And he says, find Mordechai the Jew, my courtier, and arrange a parade for him tomorrow to show that the king honors him and remembers his friends and honors those who saved his life. By the way, Haman, you came to me. I didn't call you. You must have come for something at this hour. What is it you wanted? So Haman had come because he wants permission to hang Mordechai. And one can just see Haman saying, oh, nothing important, it can wait. He has no answer. And the king must have thought that was awfully suspicious. He came running to me at 2 o'clock in the morning, and suddenly it's nothing important, it can wait. Something's rotten in Shushan. Haman returns home. Ufnei Haman chaful. He is desolate. And he does the parade the next day. He leads Mordechai through the streets. Kacha ye'aseh la'ish, thus shall be done to the man. This is all of chapter 6. Keep chanting. He comes home totally desolate, according to the Medrash, also sprayed with garbage of various sorts. And Zeresh tells him, I told you so. You start up with Mordechai and those Jews. They'll win in the end. And she goes on clattering, oh, shut up. And suddenly the messengers of the king come. He hasn't even had time to change yet. And they're rushing Haman to come to the cocktail party. Haman comes to the party. This time it doesn't say Sameach v'tov leiv. He's afraid already. And they come to the party, and now the king says to Esther, okay, we have played around long enough. Ma she'latech Esther hamalka v'tinaten la, u'ma bakashatech chatzi hamalchut v'teyas. This is the third time we've heard that question, that phrase out of Achashverosh's mouth. Vatan Esther hamalka v'tomar. Im matzati chen be'einecha hamelech. And she starts her business again of saying 2 psukim without saying anything. If I have found favor, ve'im ala melech tov, tinaten li nafshi b'sheilati v'ami v'akashet. I want only one thing from you. Save my life and my people. The king was shocked. Save your life and your people. Who would dare to harm the Jews? Who has the power to harm the Jews? And who would dare threaten you? Haman by this time must have realized what was happening. And Esther turns to him and says, Ish tsar v'oyev, this enemy of the kingdom, this terrible person, who not only isn't acting against the Jews, he is acting against the Jews. He's not acting in the king's interest. Because in the king's interest, enslave the Jews, make them miners, make them hard laborers, use them. But just to destroy tens of thousands of people on a whim, is that serving the king? Including me, and he knew it, and he avoided telling the king that it was the Jews. And the king realizes what's been done. And he is suddenly very angry and very confused. And he does what a person now thinking logically would do. He runs out into the garden to count to 10, to catch a breath of fresh air, and to think over what he suddenly realizes has happened. Everything turned topsy-turvy. And Haman, meanwhile, saw that this is the crunch. And he turns to Esther and kneels to her and spreads out his arms in petition. Esther, save me. I don't deserve it. Save me. Now, you know how the Persians used to eat on sofas, divans, masukim. What? You know how the Persians used to eat at their parties? They were reclining on divans, on sofas, the way we supposedly do at the Seder. And Esther was reclining on her sofa, and Haman kneels in front of her and spreads out his arms. And at that moment, the king comes in from the garden, from the back. And it appears to him, maybe because that's what he was thinking, that Haman is trying to rape Esther. Because the position in which he's in looks it. And he yells out, to ravage the queen in my palace with me present. And Haman, this is from the frying pan into the fire. He is silenced. And in dances Charbona, a name we've never run across before. Why in dances Charbona? Let's be realistic. Charbona is a Sris Hamela. He's a harem keeper. So he's a eunuch. And in all possibility had no interest whatsoever in women. He has different tastes. Alternative lifestyle. And he flutters into the king and says, do you know what Haman is planning for today? Did you see the height of that gallows that he built for Mordechai? Oh, it's going to be quite a hanging party. Now that was just what the king had to hear just at that moment. And the king says, hang him on it. And the big Charbona takes Haman by the scruff of his neck and takes him out. You know something? Here's a Persian eunuch. We don't know his mother's name. We don't know his father's name. We don't know his family. He never had children, that's for sure. He would have been a lost grain of dust in history. No one would have known of his existence, just as no one knows of the existence of hundreds of others like him. But because of that one moment on the stage of history, Jews have been saying for 3,000 years, the Gam Charbona Zachor Latov. He is immortalized, this Charbona. He has one line in this whole play, but he got an Academy Award. Now, okay, then the dinner went on. Okay, then Esther says who she is and what she is to Mordechai. And the king discovers she's from royalty, and he discovers that they're his real loyal allies. And he doesn't quite reverse the order, but he gives them permission to make a countermanding order, and everything turns topsy-turvy. You know, that's a phrase from the Megillah too. I think it's a key phrase. V'nahachol. Everything was reversed. The whole story of Purim is one of v'nahachol. Nothing turned out the way one normally would have predicted or would have expected. Everything went upside down. That's why we masquerade on Purim that way. Things are not what they appear. We do not look like what we are. I'll even go further. I said this one, I think last year to the ladies group, the ladies auxiliary in a message. That's the reason for, at least to my understanding, for the Jewish tradition of eating kreplach on Purim. Because on kreplach, the real essence is hidden. The meat is inside. The dough covers it all. You don't see until you sink your teeth. Of course, in history, you don't sink your teeth into it and you get nothing inside anyway. But I mean, real authentic kreplach like my mother used to make. This is now. Okay. So Esther, let's wind down. Esther sees the miraculous. By the way, she was right. Mordechai did not have the right of her. If Esther had run in and started begging, she would have had her head chopped. Esther writes to Chazal, to the wise men who are now living in Jerusalem, Kitvuni l'dorot, Kivuni l'dorot. And they said, we don't see the miracle that happened. A year or two later, they began to understand Purim became a Yom Tov. Because the miracle here was not a miracle of seas turning to blood or the sun standing still. The miracle here was simply that everything happened at its proper time, in its proper sequence, so that a human being, not a prophet, not an angel, a human being thinking logically could plan a strategy of action and hope that it would succeed. And it did, and that was God's hand in the story of Purim. But it's important for another reason. For 2,000 years, from the time of Abraham till the time of Chagas Haryo Malachi, God's word had been known to the Jewish people through prophets. In every time of crisis, prophets came, and they told the people, thus saith the Lord, and therefore they knew what to do. And whether they listened or they didn't listen, but at least there was a direct message from God, this is how you will survive. with Esther begins that long period of history which continues till now, when there are no prophets, and the word of God does not come to us revealed by the man who comes into the public square and says, "Thus saith the Lord, Kol Hashem." But it is simply the inspired vision and thought and action of people who somehow charismatically become Jewish leaders, the leaders of the Jewish people, and they have to act and they risk everything. Imavadati avadati. In order to do that which in their estimation and according to their seichel is the right way to save the Jewish people. And sometimes the best idea is the wrong idea, or the logical idea is the wrong idea. And you see that in Mordechai and Esther. Because they were not the same. There were two totally different approaches. Mordechai went with a totally religious, relying on the miracle approach. We'll say Tehillim and that will save the day. And it's a legitimate thing for a Rav to say. Esther went with an intuitive, psychological approach. And she did save the day. And the Megillah is never ever called Megillat Mordechai, but Megillat Esther. And God's messengers are not necessarily, as among the prophets, males, male, man, female, man or woman, man and woman, both together. Jewish leadership is not limited by gender. I'm not talking about the formalities or the trappings. I mean simply a good eitzim can be by Mordechai or by Esther, by man or by woman. And the period of the end of the prophets opens this period of history when we have to act by our best judgment, with strategy, with an eye to the future, and then hope that God will help us to overcome whatever the threat is. And our whole history has been one of benavot. Who would have dreamed 30, 40, 50 years ago that we would all be sitting in the biggest synagogue in Yerushalayim telling over the story? Does anybody want to ask or comment on anything?